but for as long as they have Iranian forces there with another agenda, it's going to be hard to get to that point.
But there's not a cooperative relationship between Russia and Iran in Syria. They're both supporting the Syrian regime, but they're really not overtly cooperating?
I think in this case, they both have a common objective of saving Assad.
Okay. What is Iran's attitude toward ISIS?
That is something which during there are people, I would probably defer to NEA on this for the more specifics around it and the history of that occurred, I think, in the last administration. In our mission to defeat ISIS, which the president made a priority coming into office and working with Secretary Mattis to liberate the territorial caliphate from all the lands under that control, but don't have anything to add beyond that.
So, I mean, Iran they're just kind of agnostic. They're happy to have ISIS destabilize the area.
No,
There's no evidence of support in any way, shape, or form.
This is something which I would probably defer to my colleagues that stayed on this, who have been point on the counter ISIS campaign for the specifics on this, and I'm happy to take that as a QFR.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hook, thank you for your service. In your statement, you point out of the concern of a miscalculation in the region that could spread into a much more serious conflict. Clearly, the Iranians could make a miscalculation. Clearly, the Saudis could make a miscalculation. And now Israel might make a miscalculation based upon the increased concerns about Iranian strength. So I want to just back up one moment to set the history here. Along with Senator Menendez, I opposed the JCPOA, and I strongly disagreed with the administration's decision to pull out of the JCPOA. And you pointed out that you wanted to go to a maximum pressure campaign against Iran. I support that. You also point out that prior to pulling out, that Iran was violating international standards, and we all knew that. It was not on the nuclear side, it was on the non-nuclear side. It wasn't covered under the agreement. They were in compliance with the agreement. But as President Trump had indicated his displeasure with the JCPOA, you and I had conversations that we now had maximum pressure with our European allies to get their support for sanctions against Iran on the ballistic missiles and other issues in which they were doing activity that was against international norms. And in fact, we could have had a maximum pressure campaign against Iran on the activities that you're referring to, but instead the president pulled out of the JCPOA. That's the facts, and you and I know that even the EU was prepared to go along with us on sanctions on non-nuclear, provided the United States stayed in the JCPOA. So I just want to underscore the point of Senator Menendez. Since pulling out of the JCPOA, look at the facts of what's happened. It's emboldened Iran. Look at their attack against the Saudi oil field and their capacity to do major damage. They have partnered and strengthened their position with Russia and the Assad regime in Syria, giving them additional capacity. They are now closer to restarting a nuclear weapons program than they were when we were in the JCPOA, and we have no ability to challenge that within the JCPOA. And now you talk about the UN vote on the embargo, conventional weapons, and the United States' influence is so much weaker today because we've isolated ourselves. We don't have the support of China and Russia, and we've lost the credible support of our European allies in regards to Iran. So when you talk about a maximum pressure campaign, it seems to me we gave up that maximum pressure when we pulled out of the JCPOA and isolated America. Now, I want to get to the most recent decision on President Trump pulling out of northern Syria, to the most recent conversation with President Erdogan, and then the Turkish forces going in and our Kurdish fighters that were with us in northern Syria now engaged in their own military campaign. It is clear from the facts on the ground that it's given additional influence in Syria by Russia. And there is now concern that Iran can be involved, including in the bridge to Israel's border. So I just want to get your view. The fact that we now have allowed the Turkish forces unembedded without U.S. presence to go in and fight the Kurds, does that help us or hurt us in regards to Iran? It's a simple question. I hope we can get an answer to that.
We are very comfortable with our Iran strategy in Syria.
But the specific question I'm asking is about the current situation with the Kurdish fighters now engaged with the Turks. Does that help us or hurt us in regards to the Iranian strategy?
It does not hurt our Iran strategy. So
in other words, it's helpful for us in regards to Iran to have the Kurdish fighters who were our stabilizing force in northern Iran, keeping Russia and Iran out. That's a positive view?
Well, our forces in northeast Syria have never had an Iran mission set.
But now that we're not there, and we now have the ability of Russia to take a greater capacity in Syria, allowing Iran then to come into that, to be more emboldened in Syria, you're saying that doesn't affect us?
No, because our strategy from the beginning in Syria has always been around using our diplomatic leverage, withholding reconstruction assistance, so that we can get Iranian forces under Iranian control out, and then our maximum pressure campaign. Remember, while they were in the deal, they were able to give Assad many billions of dollars.
I understand the money, but I'm trying to get to you. So you don't think there's now a greater chance of a miscalculation with Israel, looking at the Iranians having greater access in Syria, that could use drones in a similar type of an attack that we saw against the Saudis? You don't think that's a greater risk today because of what's happening in Syria?
We don't see it as a greater risk today. No, because Israel will continue to do what it needs to do to defend itself.
We know that, but suppose Israel now is on higher alert.
I haven't seen that. So if you look at our core drivers from the beginning, and nothing has changed with the president's recent decision on withdrawing troops from Syria, our strategy is around denying revenue and using diplomatic leverage in Syria to get Iranian forces out. It is undeniable that during the Iran nuclear deal, Iran was able to use the sanctions relief and give Assad many billions of dollars and 12,500 fighters. That was the big mistake. And now we're trying to do everything we can to put this back in the box.
And my last point.
But it starts with denying them revenue. And we've done that. Iran's military budget is down 28%.
I'll just make my last point on that.
Yeah.
We could deny them support from Europe on sanctions, but instead we chose to pull out of the JCPOA rather than working with our European allies. You know that was on the table before the president pulled out of the JCPOA, and we lost that opportunity to get European support for stronger sanctions.
So let me make one point on that, which I think there's been a lot the last couple of years. The president directed negotiations with the UK, France, and Germany over 6 months to see if we could fix the deficiencies of the Iran nuclear deal. And I led those negotiations, and we met in Paris and in London and Berlin and Washington multiple times over 6 months. We made a great deal of progress around the weak inspections regime and the absence of intercontinental ballistic missiles from the deal. The biggest priority was ending the sunset clauses. And for as much as people, supporters of the deal, may like the deal, it expires. It did not permanently address Iran's nuclear program. And so I spent 6 months working with the Europeans, and the biggest thing for us that I think we achieved largely agreement on inspections and on ICBMs. We were not able to get agreement on ending the sunsets.
Turned down greater pressure on Iran from the financial point of view because of the length of the JCPOA.
Say that one more time, I didn't understand.
You turned down the opportunity to get Europe with us on sanctions against Iran because you wanted a longer term on the nuclear provisions. I understand that.
Yeah.
But you turned down maximum pressure in order to get an extension of a nuclear agreement that there was already compliance on. It's inconsistent with what you're saying now. You pulled out to put additional pressure on Iran. It's inconsistent.
Well, I would say two things. One, we tried to remedy the deficiencies of the deal, and I don't know who here supports ending the nuclear restrictions on Iran. And they need to know, because the
I supported your efforts to extend that, but the nuclear agreement did not have any limitation on time. It was a permanent restriction on Iran.
It's not.
Yes, it was. So they were not allowed ever to have nuclear weapons. The question was whether
no,
provisions on
the Iran nuclear deal expires. It's going to start expiring a year from now.
Guys, hold it.
No,
You'll get your shot at them, senators. Right. I appreciate that. Let's. We're well over time, and this is a good experience to go through to litigate this. But let's try to do it as civilly as we can. And with that, Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hook. My reading is that Iran's power position has changed quite significantly as a result of Turks going into Syria, wiping out our friends, the Kurds that are remaining, rushing to Assad and pledging support to Assad. This changes the dynamic for Iran, I presume, in Iran's view, in a very positive way. I presume Iran was smiling from ear to ear as Turkey rushed into Syria. Am I right that this really changes the dynamic for Iran in Syria and perhaps regionally?
We do not believe that it changes the dynamic with Iran, because in terms of our strategy...
Things are not better for Iran in the Middle East as we have gone, as Turkey has hit the Kurds, and the Kurds have now allied with Assad. So surely Assad is stronger. And this isn't good for Iran?
If you take a look at what our U.S. Special Representative Jim Jeffrey has said for some time now, our military is in Syria for ISIS. Our diplomacy is focused on Iran. And so that's why Jim Jeffrey and I work together very closely, because what I do on the pressure side and what he does on withholding reconstruction assistance is mutually reinforcing.
I hear you, but diplomacy has impact if there's a military that's strong and in the region, and when our ally now aligns with our adversary, Assad, that is, in my opinion, not helpful for diplomacy and not helpful for our interests in the region. That's so dramatic a perspective on your part that Iran is not celebrating what's happening in Syria is extraordinary to me. Let me turn to a different area, which is that I do agree that there is an enormous benefit in putting pressure on Iran. Whether it's maximum pressure or not, I don't know. But I believe that a nation that decides to go nuclear should suffer a dramatic cost for doing so. Whether or not they're at their knees or not, I don't know. And it's very hard for us to tell from the outside what's actually going on inside Iran. But clearly, it would have a dramatic effect if other nations were to join us in applying maximum pressure. What are the prospects for our European friends, for other nations around the world joining us, either with the snapback provisions being applied or not on a snapback basis? What are the prospects of us actually seeing truly maximum pressure, because it's applied not just by us but by our friends as well?
There is no precedent in Iran's history for the kind of pressure that we have put on them. And the regime has said this publicly. That they're experiencing the kind of economic contraction that is and will be worse than what happened during the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. We have done a very good job of drying up Iran's sources of export revenue, but we've devoted as much energy to enforcing our sanctions, especially in the case of the oil sanctions. And I think that the fact that the UK, France, and Germany have now acknowledged something that we saw some time ago, that the Iran deal is insufficient to address Iran's threats to peace and security, and that when you are inside the deal, you can't touch your energy or your financial sanctions. That was the deal. So being out of the deal gives us a great deal more leverage to accomplish the objectives of denying Iran a nuclear weapon
I'm
and
not-
on missile proliferation, which I think other countries are
Mr.
starting
Hook,
to recognize.
I'm not one of those that thinks we should be back in JCPOA, and I do believe that there should be an enormous price paid by a country that decides to go nuclear. I don't know whether we'll actually ever see Iran make a different decision, but my question is there some prospect of our being able to get other nations to join us in applying maximum pressure on Iran, or must we continue to do it alone?
I think it depends on how. So Europe has done a lot. They have not reimposed the financial sanctions that were in place. But when you look at what Europe has done since the time that we left the Iran deal, it's a fairly extensive list. And they have Germany and I believe France and the UK have all denied landing rights to Mahan Air, which is an Iranian commercial airline, which is a dual-use commercial airline and also ferries terrorists and weapons around the Middle East to their proxies. The EU did impose sanctions on Iran's Ministry of Intelligence for terrorism in Europe. And you've also had the E3 send a number of letters to the UN Security Council condemning Iran's space launch vehicle testing, Iran's ballistic missile testing. You had Boris Johnson a few weeks ago said the Iran deal is a bad deal with many, many defects. That has been our position.
Mr. Hook, my time is up. I just want to point out that the letters and speeches are delightful, but crippling sanctions on the part of our allies would make a real difference, I believe, in exacting a very substantial price on Iran and hopefully causing dissent within their own country. But I think it should be a high priority of our country to get other nations to join us in those crippling sanctions. My time is up, so I'm going to pass the time over to the
and
chairman.
I agree with that last point.
And can I say one other thing on that? I'm happy to submit for the record, this is 3 pages of European action starting in July 28th, going up to September 24th, 2019. I talk on a weekly basis with my European counterparts, not just the E3, but we just had Poland in town. We did a global ministerial on the Middle East to promote peace and stability in Warsaw, Poland. We had 65 nations from almost every continent attend. So we have made working with our partners a priority. That's under Secretary Hale, Secretary Pompeo, Deputy Secretary Sullivan. And so I'm happy to submit for the record 3 pages of everything that Europe has done to counter Iran's threats.
Thank you. Those will be included in the record for full disclosure to everyone. And with that, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr.
Chairman, without taking the senator's time, can you tell me how we're going to proceed since votes have just started? Is the chairman intending to keep the hearing going as members come in and out of vote?
Well, I think this is an important hearing, and I
agree.
I think probably what we ought to do is get down to the very end and take a short break, and everybody go vote, and then we'll come back here.
Thank you.
This is, I know I see a lot of anxiousness on my friends' parts over here that would like to bite the apple, and I want to give them every opportunity to do so. So with that, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hook, I want to follow up on the line of questioning that my colleagues have pursued with respect to Syria, because the shift by Kurdish forces who were our partners in the fight against ISIL away from the United States and into alignment with Iran and Russia, I believe is going to have serious implications for Syria and for the region. And it's hard for me to understand that you think there's no, or at least you appear to think there's no connection between what's going to happen in Syria and our efforts to address what's happening in Iran. Now, the president said on Twitter that anyone, and I'm quoting, anyone who wants to assist Syria in protecting the Kurds is good with me, whether it's Russia, China, or Napoleon Bonaparte. I hope they all do great. We're 7,000 miles away. That's an end to the quote. So does this anyone, who the president is referring to, also extend to Iran? And are you concerned about a Kurdish-Iranian alliance in the Syrian conflict and what its impact on U.S. interests in the region will be?
As I said earlier, Syria is not going to see a return to normal until they direct forces under Iranian control to leave. And we do have enormous leverage in that space. Speaking just as...
Can you just further elaborate what our leverage is? Because it appears to me, given the pullout of troops, and I appreciate what you're saying about reconstruction dollars, but the fact is they are years away from reconstruction at this point. And so we had a very small amount of troops partnering with Kurdish forces to maintain a significant area in northeast Syria that was stable, where the United States had influence, where we were wanted. And what you're telling me now is that we have pulled out those troops and we have greater leverage than we had before?
I didn't say that. What I am saying is that our pressure campaign, because, as I said, Shia fighters don't have the money that they used to, Iran doesn't have the money that it used to support Assad and to support its proxies. And so Iran is going to face a dilemma. They can either support guns in Syria or prioritize the needs of their own people at home. And that is the choice that we are trying to force upon the regime.
And so, have we not just empowered them further by pulling out of northeast Syria and giving Iran more influence in the region and more ability to negotiate with Russia? You know, I heard the Obama administration talk about how we were going to starve Syria of the funds they needed to continue to engage in a civil war, and that never happened. And what our experience has been with crippling sanctions, I think they're important, but they are not the only way, the only tool in the toolbox for us to address these conflicts. So I guess I would go on to ask you, in September, you noted that it's clear we need to reestablish deterrence. We're one missile strike away from regional war. I think that's a quote. Could you speak to how this administration plans to reestablish deterrence against Iran, and what specific options, other than sanctions, are on the table to penalize Iran for its destabilizing behavior?
Well, the first thing you have to do is to stop doing what's not working. And there is no question that Iran increased its missile proliferation and its missile testing. I talked about newly declassified.
I don't want to talk about JCPOA. What I want to talk about is what the administration has on the table now to address Iran's destabilizing behavior.
And I'm making that, but that is part of it, is we have to stop doing what we're doing or we're going to get more of the same. So we broke the paradigm of not having sufficient leverage and pressure to drive up the cost of Iranian aggression. And so we are only, 5 or 6 months into having all of our sanctions imposed. Because for the first 6 months after getting out of the deal, we granted a few oil waivers. Now, since May, we're about 5 or 6 months into this, and we have achieved record results. But we also have to understand that we never promised that we would...
How do you define record results?
Because the regime is materially weaker today than when it was when we took office two and a half years
I
ago.
appreciate that on paper that's the case.
But it is, it's
but
not just
when
on
we
paper.
look at the behavior that they are exhibiting, both in the region and in terms of our interests in the region, they have increased that destabilizing behavior.
It isn't an increase. I do want you to take a look at all 71 instances of this. Iran for 40 years has been running a steady state of aggression and using terrorism as a tool of statecraft. And as I said, they want the world to accept a normal level of terrorism, as they defined it. And then when the world stands up to them, they increase it to a level to put pressure on people so that they'll return to their normal level. We
Mr.
are
Hook,
breaking this
I
paradigm.
have heard you make this argument this morning, and I appreciate that that's an argument that the administration has. I'm just not buying that argument at this point. And what I'm asking is, what are the plans, what are the additional plans beyond sanctions that will address their behavior? And my time is up, so I'm not going to ask you to respond to that. But I do have one final question that I'd like to ask you, and that is, do you believe that ISIS has been defeated in Syria? That's a yes or no.
The territorial caliphate has been defeated. We have liberated all the land that was held by ISIS. Now, it's a separate question on the forces of extremism. That's a separate question.
Okay, do you believe that the forces of extremism have been defeated in Syria?
there is no one who will claim that the forces of extremism have not been defeated in the Middle East in any administration. There is a crisis of Islamist extremism that has been going on for many decades. And we have
we just exacerbated by pulling American troops out of northeast Syria. And we have given rise to the potential for ISIS to come back in Syria, in Iraq, all across the region, and that empowers Iran.
And I think it is clearly the case that Iran, if you talk to countries in the region, and here's an area where you're going to hear complete agreement from the Israelis and the other Arab countries on the front lines of Iranian aggression, is that Iran expanded its power over the last many years. And we came into office with a regime that was enjoying a very healthy economy, a healthy military budget, strong proxies, and there was a deficit of trust that we inherited with our Sunni partners and with Israel. And I would say that our bilateral relations with all of these countries has been markedly improved, and we have helped to shrink the Iran tumor. But we're only at this for this has only been a matter of about a year and a half since leaving the deal. And you don't have to take my word for it. In March, the New York Times ran a front page story documenting that Iran's proxies are weaker today. And then the Washington Post ran a follow-on story in June documenting how Iran's proxies are weaker because of our sanctions. These are stories that were not written about prior to our pressure campaign.
Senator Paul.
You know, if we step back and ask the question, do sanctions work? I think it's a bigger, broader question. We think, it's all we can do, so we do sanctions, and we do more, and we're doing maximum pressure. I think they're having an economic effect. Nobody questions that, but are they working to bring Iran to the negotiating table? Let's say they aren't really working. So I think it's a fact of loss of trust. I think that Iran feels that we are not trustworthy because of pulling out of the agreement that was worked on for so many years. I think it's also a matter of having naive expectations that they're going to agree to 12 points, much of which they didn't agree to in the previous agreement. So I think it's going to be very difficult to get started because of the lack of trust and starting with some things that were not agreed to previously and were specifically agreed to different limits, like no enrichment and the ballistic missile agreement. I think Iran sees their ballistic missiles as a deterrent as well. Great. And I don't think they're willing to give up a deterrent as they see Saudi Arabia spending $83 billion a year. We're like, oh my goodness, Iran spends $14 billion. Well, that's 1/50th of what we spend, and it's about 1/4 or even less than 1/4 of what Saudi Arabia. If you add in Saudi Arabia's allies, you can see why Iran might say, please, why they might not say, please take my ballistic missiles. They're not jumping up and down to do this, and they're really, even against the world superpower that can defeat them in a moment, willing to keep pricking and prodding because we're unrealistic in what we ask. And I think by pulling out showed that we're not to be trusted from their perspective. So your problem there is you have an unwilling partner. In Syria, it's a little bit different. In Syria, we've been unwilling to negotiate in the sense that our goal has been, remove Assad or replace Assad, and so no one wants to negotiate with Assad. I think the one thing that hasn't been picked up on yet, and I think it's going to be ironic because everybody seems to be concerned about the Kurds, is actually I think the Kurds' permanent solution is much more likely to come from Assad. He's there. He largely is going to stay, barring something untoward happening to him from his own people. But the war is largely over. Assad stays. So really, if we're going to be realistic about this and we want to protect the Kurds, maybe the diplomatic arena has gotten simplified. Now, essentially, you have Turkey on one side and Syria on the other. And so really, I think our goal, everybody's going to talk about the sanctions, which I frankly don't think will work. But I think really somebody from the State Department that's involved with diplomacy ought to be saying, why don't we try to use our leverage to get Turkey now and Assad to talk? But we would have to acknowledge that someone's going to talk to Assad. And I think if we did, the goal would actually be to allow the Kurds to live in the northeastern quadrant of Syria, similar to the way the Kurds live in Iraq. Wasn't always easy there. It's been very messy, and there have been a lot of problems. But currently, the Iraqi Kurds trade with the Turks and have a fairly decent and robust trade over the last 10 years that's actually increased. So I think we shouldn't look at this as all Sturm and Drang and that, oh my goodness, the Kurds are being wiped out and all of this. I think we should look at it as an opportunity, actually, as a breakthrough diplomatically because we've simplified who needs to talk to whom at this point. And so I would just hope, and I guess my question is there anybody in the State Department actually looking to take an opportunity of the new dynamic in the last 24 hours that if Assad could reassure Erdogan that he's going to prevent incursions and that he's going to respect the border with Turkey and that he's going to use a real government with the stability of a real government, is there a possibility Erdogan would simply withdraw under that guarantee? That's the kind of conversation that we've kind of prevented from happening because we don't want anybody, we wouldn't let the Kurds talk to Assad. So in some ways, I think there may be a breakthrough here. Your comments?
Well, my understanding that there is a member briefing that is in the works to try to be organized that would focus on Syria. So that's probably a question that's best left to my colleague, my counterpart, Jim Jeffrey, who's lead on Syria. Can I answer your question about...
Do you see a way the Kurds could permanently live in Syria without some kind of arrangement with the Syrian government?
I'm going to stay in my lane and let Jim Jeffrey answer that question, but I do want to answer your Iran question that you asked at the top. Iran does have a history of coming to the table in the context of sanctions, and we saw that in the run-up to the Iran nuclear deal. We have also seen that in various times when the United States
But I think you have to be willing to offer something. Simply saying we're not going to offer any relief. If you were willing to offer relief of some of the export to Asia of their oil so you don't have a complete embargo on them, yeah, I think they'd talk in a heartbeat. But that would be offering something. And it would have been easier before they attacked Saudi Arabia. I agree it's easier to offer them something now. But 6 months ago, had you offered them relief of some of the sanctions in order to get the talk started, I think you might have had a chance. Now nobody wants to offer any relief because everybody's the heightened tensions between the countries. I think it's more difficult now to get started.
Sanctions relief was not granted in the run-up to what became the Iran nuclear deal. And I think once you establish that precedent...
You had a unified Europe at that time, too. You had a little bit more pressure, but you also had the engagement of the Obama administration actually talking to them, and there was more trust then. There's less trust now because we basically pulled out of something that they were adhering to.
Well, on that, we have made it clear that we're open to meeting. Iran has rejected the offer. And by the way, they rejected the offer while we were in the deal. Iran rejected our offers of meeting while we were in the Iran nuclear deal. It didn't happen after we left the deal. And so they have consistently rejected diplomacy. I think they have a theory of the case that their resistance is greater than our pressure. We're very comfortable with the foreign policy that we have in place because we know that the regime has less revenue to spend on its military budget and on all of its... We're forcing them to make very hard choices. And as I said earlier, I've looked at the 40-year history of it. If talking nicely with the Iranians worked, we would have solved this a long time ago. But it doesn't. This is a regime that only respects and understands strength.
They don't consider an embargo of their main export talking nicely to them. You have to. I'm not saying it's justified, but that you have to understand their perspective. They don't understand this to be nice talk when we have an embargo on their main export.
But that oil goes to fund terrorism. So if you let Iran sell oil, they use it for terrorist operations. So we don't want Iran to sell its oil. That's why we put in place the embargo that the sanctions that we have on Iran's oil exports. And that's tens of billions of dollars in revenue that they would otherwise spend on Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Palestine, Islamic Jihad, Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. That's a good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Hook. And we're going to have to take a break. At this point, we've got some votes going on. We're going to go vote on the number 1, number 2, and then we will be back in session, and appreciate your patience. Thank you. You're welcome to use our anteroom.
Thank you.
Senate Foreign Relations Committee will be in recess.